I think that the absence of the U.S., some reluctance and complexity in the way that some other developed countries are dealing with climate have opened some space for the world to see what developing countries are doing.
And we must remember that this COP process is ultimately all about people. People who may not follow every negotiation, but who feel the consequences in their anxiety about intensifying disasters, in food prices, insurance costs, and energy bills that rise with every drought, flood, storm, and heat wave. They know a shallow promise when they hear one, and they know that cheaper renewable energy, cleaner air, and greater security are prizes worth fighting for. We need to get straight to the hardest issues quickly, no delay. None of us can afford it. We've built the engine. Paris is working to take us forward. Now it's time to hit the accelerator for people, prosperity, and the planet.
Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. You heard from Simon Steele, who is the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, and also Andrea Correa Dolago, who is the President of COP30. Yes, while we of course look ahead to the G20 Summit, COP30 still remains an important discussion point as the climate change within our globe continues to become a crisis that some nations are looking to go ahead and address, while others look at it as a bystanding topic. And with G20 occurring, climate change and the discussion of it is going to take center stage with regards to that. Let me welcome my next guest, Richard Worthington, who represents the African Civil Society and is an individual who is quite knowledgeable and an expert when it comes to climate change. Richard, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us on Mzansi Welcomes the World.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Richard, I think we know the G20 Leaders Summit is going to tackle a wide range of climate issues such as mitigation, adaptation, finance, and just transition. Which of these areas do you believe is the most urgent, not just for South Africa, but the African continent as a whole?
Well, I'd be careful about generalizing about Africa as a whole. In the case of South Africa, we are somewhat better equipped and more responsible for climate change than the rest of the continent. But I think it's clear that finance is an overriding priority for the continent. And in particular, the G20 has been tasked with looking at the global financial architecture that was set up about 80 years ago now, and which is keeping a lot of developing countries, and particularly African countries, in debt, and therefore with less opportunities to do any of the other things, including developing in a way that is low carbon and climate resilient, adapting to the changes that we are already facing as a result of a heating planet, and also the issue of a just transition. Although again, for South Africa, the positioning there is slightly different. We have a well-advanced energy system and a pretty good industrial base. So we have great opportunities for reducing the emissions from highly polluting coal-fired power plants, electrifying our transport, etc. Those opportunities in the rest of Africa are not about transitioning away from something, but simply embracing sustainable development, which does require financing and needs to be done on terms that don't push countries deeper into debt.
Richard, on the subject of climate finance, how do you evaluate the current state for funding for climate adaptation and nature-based solutions in Africa? And what do you hope the G20 will address in this regard?
Well, at the moment, I think the prospects are somewhat dismal. some of the things that are advanced under the name of nature-based solutions are moving ahead faster because of their link to market mechanisms. But we need to be really careful about things done in the name of nature-based solutions when they involve carbon crediting, because this often alienates the local people from their resource base and does not provide a long-term secure contribution to mitigating climate change.
Richard, what specific outcomes from the G20 would you like to see bolster ecosystem resilience and biodiversity protection in South Africa? Of course, this is a South African hosted G20. So with regards to that, what are you hoping to see that will create a specific outcomes from the summit in terms of ecosystem and biodiversity?
Well, we have not yet had G20 embrace the global biodiversity framework that was developed couple of years ago, and calls for protection of, it's called 30 by 30, 30% of land and marine ecosystems protected by 2030. And that is a great benchmark, which it would be good to see embraced by the G20 Leaders Summit. In terms of adaptation, we also need to look at the ways that it is costed, because if you only look at the incremental costs of the adaptation component of a lot of interventions, it means that they get sidelined. So a more comprehensive approach to adaptation would really be helpful, that recognizes not only that climate change is primarily the result of the emissions of the developed countries, but the linkages between the ongoing extractive paradigm of development and the concentration of wealth amongst a small global elite, which, a lot of the things that are required in the name of adaptation within Africa, it's the basics of sustainable development. And this is being hampered by the extractive paradigm of the global financial system, which has put us in a great deal of debt and with less control over our own resource base.
Richard, I want you to keep 3 words in your head: drill, baby, drill, because I guess you know where I'm coming with regards to this. Many of the G20 nations, they've given the thumbs up to deal with the threats of climate change. But there's one nation, just one, that seems to be either tiptoeing it or clearly does not want to address this issue. That is the United States. And they are taking up the presidency of the G20 next year. Should the world be concerned about this, and how concerned should we be?
Well, 2 things. One, let's not generalize from President Trump and fellow travelers to the whole of the United States of America, because the position taken by the current administration is not shared by many states and local governments. So I wouldn't say that the United States as a whole has rejected climate action. On the other hand, Trump does have some fellow travelers, like the president of Argentina. Now, they are of considerable concern, but should not be used as cover by other countries to fall back from the climate actions they've already committed to. And, we've had indications that South Africa is using the obstructionist positioning of Trump as cover for setting low bar mitigation targets. This is the kind of thing that, concern about bringing the whole of the United States administration back into the climate response community is warranted, but translating that concern into backsliding by countries that claim that they recognize climate science and are responding accordingly would not be, that's not what we want people's concerns to revolve around. The concern must focus on how we support the progressive forces within the United States to come back on board with the Paris Agreement, etc.
Well, you mentioned Paris Agreement, and that's where the conversation will continue after this break. I'm still in conversation with Richard Worthington. Mzansi welcomes the world, returns after this break. Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. I'm still in conversation with Richard Worthington, who represents African civil society. He's also an expert on climate change. Now, Richard had mentioned the Paris Agreement, and of course, this is a legally binding international treaty signed 10 years ago, aiming to limit global warming to well below 3 degrees Celsius. The preferable target was, of course, 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So, Richard, we are in the 10th year. Of course, this formally came into binding in 2016. How much bearing will this Paris Agreement come into play in terms of the discussions around climate challenges at this year's G20?
Perhaps not so much at the G20 itself. The clip you showed earlier, I think, demonstrates that the vast majority of countries at the climate summit COP30 in Belém, Brazil, are continuing with implementation, assessment of progress on the Paris Agreement. So when it comes to G20, I think the focus will need to be on the enabling conditions for that kind of implementation. And that brings us back to the issue of the global financial architecture. There are proposals, for example, to have an agreement on a minimum level of taxation. This is something which would really help addressing global inequality. And it's not for nothing that South Africa chose the theme of solidarity, equity, and sustainability, because we do not rely only on climate agreements to get people to behave in a responsible manner that bears in mind the interests not only of current, but also future generations. So while the Paris Agreement remains a benchmark, and by the way, it's below 2 degrees, that is the objective of the Paris Agreement, with a view to trying to stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So 3 degrees would be an absolute nightmare. We need to keep global warming below 2 degrees. I think that benchmark will still be in everybody's minds that is participating at the G20. But rather than duplicating what's happening under the climate negotiations, this group of the most developed and richest nations in the world really need to look at the enabling conditions, to look at making finance available at a lower cost of capital to developing countries. The current system under the International Monetary Fund, which is also about 80 years old, is really not fit for purpose. It wasn't designed with our current scientific knowledge of the interactions between ecosystems, economies, and it did not provide for a world which has the population we have today and has already seen the level of natural destruction that is continuing apace.
Richard, you corrected me there in terms of the degree Celsius. And for the layman out there, and I'm going to include myself in this, to ask the question, okay, so what is the difference between a 1 degree Celsius? What is the difference, and how important is that understanding of it, given the context where we are right now in terms of climate change?
It's absolutely crucial. One of the things that the most recent assessment by the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made really clear is that every 0.1 degree Celsius of global average heating has massive impacts. It would be crass to try and talk about this in terms of the rate of attrition of the human race, but there are studies which indicate that once we pass above about 2.5 degrees, that rate will be absolutely horrendous. So, a lot depends on how we cope going forward, but every increment of 1 degree of Celsius, because this is global planetary heating. So, this is not about having a 1 degree temperature difference in daily average temperatures. In different parts of the world, it plays out differently. It means far more days of excessive heat where people won't be able to work during the middle of the day because of of heat stroke. There's any number of impacts that escalate with each 0.1 of a degree. And we've seen in the latest tipping points report that the impacts on corals globally are they've reached the point where there's a level of dieback which is going to have dire consequences for marine fisheries. Corals are a breeding ground for a lot of marine life. We harvest a lot of marine life to feed people, and these are all factors which even small changes in the average global heating result in extreme changes in weather conditions, which play out differently in different parts of the world, in different climate systems. Certainly, we expect to see, for example, wetter conditions in the east of southern Africa with more flooding and more destructive downpours, while on the eastern side, we're more likely to have drier conditions and a more negative impact on the productivity of land, its suitability for agriculture, etc. So how this will play out in southern Africa, which on average, particularly inland, is warming at double the global rate. So the 1.5 degrees of warming that we've seen globally, if you look at the short-term average, is equivalent to a 3 degrees rise in the average temperature of the Southern African interior.
Richard, I want to touch on this Baku to Belém roadmap. For the viewers out there, it's aiming to transform climate finance for developing nations. The figure is around $1.3 trillion by 2035. Richard, how important will this discussion be in the Leaders Summit, especially when it comes to developing nations? And bear in mind, South Africa, as a developing nation, taking up the mantle of this year's G20 presidency.
Again, I think I'd refer that primarily to the COP currently in Brazil, because it is a product of the Conference of Parties of the UN Convention on Climate Change. So, the prospects for G20 are compromised by the behavior of the next host country, and trying to get greater buy-in to that Baku to Belém roadmap. G20 will not be a great place for doing that. But again, we need to be looking beyond individual sets of pledges, which is what this is. It's an inadequate pledge. It is well below what science and civil society have recommended as a target for mobilizing climate finance. So I don't see it being hindered particularly, that target, by the G20, but to achieve it, we have not yet seen major steps in that direction. And again, we need to come back to the global financial architecture and the way that trade relations are currently designed to basically protect the rich elite and leave those who are most desperately in need of this kind of financial support not getting access to it. So, the G20 outcomes that have been agreed in the working groups leading up to the Leaders Summit have a number of sort of subheadings under that, and we might see some advance there. But the Baku to Belém roadmap, I think, is for a while going to remain aspirational, but it's better than not having any benchmark at all.
Richard, one final question. If Richard Worthington could secure one headline commitment from G20 leaders that would make a difference to environmental and climate justice outcomes within South Africa, what would that be?
Well, that would be coming back to the issue of fossil fuels, which was first addressed in 2009 with a vague commitment to phase out subsidization of fossil fuels, that is, inefficient for the economy. And we do not yet even have a global registry of fossil fuel reserves and resources, and yet we're calling on some countries to develop away from those, while other countries are still piling into investments. And when I say countries, of course, there's private corporations, but there's also state-owned oil and gas companies. So if there's one thing that would be really good to get, it would be a resolute commitment to phase out all subsidization of fossil fuels and apply full cost accounting to investment decisions that are being made. You know, it's not just Trump that's running around saying drill, baby, drill. We've got NJ Ayuk in Africa trying to persuade countries that offering profits to fossil fuel companies is the best way to get investment into Africa. Well, it might work for his consultancy business, but it certainly isn't the way to ensure sustainable energy and development for all.
Richard Worthington, absolute pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
That's Richard Worthington, who represents African civil society and an expert on climate change. Well, that's all we have for you here on Mzansi Welcomes the World. If you've missed today's episode, be sure to find it on our YouTube channel. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.